Pleasure to be back in a fairly busy Westminster Hall, and thank you to all colleagues for expressing an interest in today's debate. I'd like to also thank, in preparation for today's debate, the many organisations and charities who I'm sure have been in touch with all honourable and right honourable members to prepare briefings, particularly the work, I should mention, of the Conservative Environment Network. Ms Rees, reducing plastic waste is a mammoth topic to try and tackle, and I fear our short time today will only give us time to scratch the surface. But I'd like to begin, I think, by outlining why this is such an important issue. Why is it important that we have this discussion? It's something that's often raised with me by residents in Carshalton and Wallington, and I'm sure many honourable and right honourable members here today will be sharing similar experiences from their own constituencies. I indeed had the pleasure of visiting Culvers House Primary School in Hackbridge very recently, where the pupils, after the pupils wrote to me about plastic pollution and why they were so passionate about it and why they thought that there was more that could and should be done. So I'm very, very grateful for their insight as well. And I think it's fair to say that we all know the harm that the scourge of plastic pollution does to our environment, but it's worth, I think, going over some of the numbers because they do make some very stark reading. Plastic waste in the UK is continuing to grow, with over half of all plastics ever manufactured having been made in the last 15 years alone, and an estimated 5 million tonnes being used every year, and nearly half of that is packaging alone. Plastic waste harms our natural environment if not recycled, lasting centuries in landfill, or if discarded as litter, polluting our oceans, our rivers, and our soils, and the creatures that rely on them. And of course, plastic production and waste contributes to climate change. Indeed, current projections show that if the strong growth of plastic usage continues as expected, then emissions of greenhouse gases by the global plastic sector will account for 15% of the entire global annual carbon budget by 2050. Again, this barely scratches the surface of the scale of the issue, but it gives an indicator of the challenge we face and the action that must be taken. And it's here that I want to say a big thank you to the Chamber engagement team here at the House of Commons for the amazing work that they have done, engaging with the public ahead of today's debate to find out what people think is a priority. And can I thank the over 500 people that have taken part in that survey and in that exercise. And I'd just like to go over some of the headline figures that came out of that piece of work. People were asked what measures should be taken to ensure that plastic waste is recycled, rather than sent to landfill or incinerators. And respondents came back with many suggestions, such as better education on how to recycle and the need to recycle, more consistency in approaches across local authorities, with many citing confusion from moving from one area to another, preventing recyclable materials from being sent abroad, and introducing deposit return schemes, and I'll go into that a little bit later. But I think the Minister, it's fair to say, after I think 3 or 4 debates I've held in this place about incinerators, will know my particular passion about making sure that these are properly regulated after the one operating in my constituency opened, and the visit that I had there where I witnessed recyclable plastic waste being put in the incinerator. So I know that the Minister is well aware of my interest there. The second question that respondents were asked was what steps should be taken to reduce the amount of plastic waste being reduced in the first place. And suggestions here included things such as banning single-use plastics, especially for food products, using incentives or legislation or both to assist transition away from plastic packaging, and holding businesses accountable for the plastic that they produce. And I think the thing that stood out for me in this particular question was this word reduce. We often speak about recycling and reusing, both of which are much, much better, of course, than landfill and incineration. Nevertheless, we must remember that the peak of the waste hierarchy, the best thing that we can do, is reduce the amount of waste we produce in the first place. So that must be, of course, the aim that we look to. And finally, people were asked about how we can use technology to reduce the amount of plastic that is produced and deal with plastic that is within the circular economy at the moment. And suggestions here included things such as using technology to find alternatives to plastics, particularly when it comes to packaging. Things such as investing in technologies like biodegradable or compostable plastics, new technologies to look at labelling to track the life cycle of plastics and use that as an education technique, and using plastics in more innovative ways for things such as house building, roads, pavements or construction, images I'm sure that many colleagues would have seen from around the world before. And indeed, it has been a pleasure for me to meet with many businesses, charities and organisations who are looking at developing these new technologies or do have these new technologies which they are trying to use as a way of dealing with this issue. And whilst there's no silver bullet, as it were, I'm sure that everyone would agree that there's no one solution and no one thing that we can offer. But these new technologies that are out there, whilst they don't offer all the answers, certainly give us a chance to make a considerable impact. Of course, I will.
Thank you, Member, for giving way. And I think, like myself, he was a councillor and presumably still is a councillor. When I was a councillor in Camden in 2010, to the start of this pandemic, there were £16 billion worth of cuts to the local government, and the Environment Agency saw its government funding slashed by nearly 2/3. Now, the direct result that I saw of this underfunding is that councils have struggled to deal with plastic waste effectively, and there's not been enough monitoring and enforcement of the rules. So I wanted to ask him, as a fellow Member of Parliament, but also as an existing councillor, that does he agree reducing plastic waste relies on local councils and bodies like the Environment Agency having the resources they need to do so?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for that question. She raises a very important point. The only thing I would observe is that there are councils who are doing incredibly good work increasing their recycling rates, and all of them are facing similar pressures. But I'm sure she will go more into her argument later in her speech, and I thank her for that contribution. I do want to thank Ms Rees, those who shared their views and information and engaged with the Commons Chamber engagement team in advance of this debate, because what has come out loud and clear is that call to action in tackling plastic waste, and indeed action is being taken. And there are things that I want to acknowledge and some measures that I want to pay tribute to before I go any further. Things such as the restriction on supplies of plastic straws, stirrers and cotton buds, for example, and the ban on microbeads. I welcome the consultation that's coming this autumn on banning more single-use plastic items and the government's commitment to prevent all avoidable plastic by the end of 2042. I do welcome the requirement for large retailers to charge 10 pence for a single-use plastic carrier, and again, that amazing figure of 95% reduction in the use of plastic bag sales since 2015 is very welcome indeed. I welcome the measures in the Environment Bill, such as charges on single-use plastic items, ensuring producers take greater responsibility for their waste, establishing consistent approaches in recycling across England, tackling waste crime, enforcing litter offences, delivering on the manifesto pledge to ban the export of polluting plastic to non-OECD countries, among many others. I welcome the plastic packaging tax, which is coming into force from April 2022, and indeed leading the Commonwealth in fighting against marine plastic pollution through the Blue Planet Fund. These are very welcome measures indeed, but of course there is always more that can and should be done to tackle this huge issue. And one that I would pick out immediately is again that push for an all-in deposit return scheme, which will capture and estimate up to 3 times more than an on-the-go system. I will indeed.
Thank you, honourable friend, for giving way and indeed for calling this important debate. He refers to the deposit return scheme, which we hope will be introduced in the next couple of years. Does he have any thoughts about the possibility of a novel solution using digital technology, for instance, to capture plastic wrappers, crisp wrappers that litter our streets and countryside using digital means?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and I think that's an incredibly important thing that the government should definitely be looking at, and I would urge the Minister to take that away, because the deposit return scheme described only does refer to plastic bottles, as for example, and we know that there are opportunities and examples from around the world where this can be expanded to include much more, so I definitely think that is something that should be looked at. But I would just finish, Ms Rees, by saying that whilst it is important that government takes action and businesses take on more responsibility, as the saying goes, it is true that old habits die hard, and what is potentially our biggest challenge is the change of behaviour of us ourselves and we as individuals. And I will indeed give way.
To congratulate my honourable friend on bringing this debate today. It's an important issue. In his many measures that he outlined earlier, there was also a measure that I remember that the coalition government introduced, which was the plastic bag tax. Now, when he was talking a moment ago about personal responsibility, would he not perhaps urge the Minister to look at increasing the plastic bag tax and levy to encourage people to take greater responsibility in their own habits and their own shopping habits.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for that intervention, and I think it has been proof of the success of the plastic bag tax in that figure, the 95% cut figure, and it obviously has worked. So I would indeed, through my honourable friend, urge the Minister to do just that. And Ms Rees, this is where I do have a strange sense of déjà vu. The honourable member did mention my time as a councillor. Indeed, this was the first topic I ever spoke about as a councillor. This was the topic we were discussing during that full council motion almost 3 years ago. But the point that I made then, I think, still stands, that without buy-in from people at large and all of us playing our part, lasting change, of course, will be difficult. So I do think those survey responses from members of the public do point to some really important things that need to be done, particularly this point about education, but also making transitions and making changes as simple as possible and as easy as possible, so that it's simple for people to make. And later this year, I hope to do my part in doing just that, and hosting a local event to coincide with COP26, during which I hope to do a session on what changes we can make right here, right now, to reduce the amount of plastic waste that we contribute. But I hope the central message that I can end on and leave behind is that need to look at the circular economy and always keep one eye fixed sharply at the top of that waste hierarchy. Because if done right, we can bring businesses and individuals along with us, not as some kind of burden or punitive measure, but as a positive contribution to our environment, the world that we live in, and indeed the creatures that we share it with.
Thank you. The question is that this House has considered reducing